Good morning. How are you doing? Happy Juneteenth. Today we're going to be doing some ocean type landscapes. So I'm going to be using just a dried palette here. Any watercolors you have will be just fine. And we'll get started in just a minute. How's everybody's Saturday morning going? I'm having a little bit of a slower start this morning. But it's been a nice, relaxed morning, so that's good. Afternoon? Yes, I guess technically it's afternoon. It might be evening where you are. Let's start there. What time is it for everyone? And do you have any fun plans for the day? Noon, right in the middle. So today we're going to be doing ocean type beachy things, reflections. So yeah, that's what we're going to work today. 12:57. I love the specificity. So we're going to be starting kind of simple with the water stuff. Water is one of the most difficult things to paint because it moves in such unique ways and reflects light. So we're going to be starting simple and just learning a little bit about that with reflections. And yeah, plans are to pack up everything for Father's Day. Oh, nice. We're going to go visit with my grandpa today for Father's Day. You can use whatever size papers you want. I'm going to be using about 4x4, 3x3, 4x3s. I find that working smaller, especially with complex things, actually helps simplify things a little bit. But if you're more comfortable working larger, that's totally fine. You can expand these a bit. Why did I start with watercolor? I don't know. I love the medium. It's easy. It's pretty easy to clean up, compact, travelable. Wow, that's not the word. It's easy to travel with. And I also like how you are forced to be a little bit more abstracted with it. When I paint with acrylic, I tend to I'm not like hyper realistic or anything, but I tend to want to be more realistic, and it seems more difficult, and I lose some of the magic with it. So that's why I like watercolor. So I'm using a 140-pound cold press paper. This is the Canson XL, which is my favorite. And it's now 11, so I'll get started with introductions and then we'll get started taping things down. My name is Lacey Walker, and I am the artist behind Rebel Unicorn Crafts, and you can find me on Instagram, Lacey Walker Art, or Rebel Unicorn Crafts. I also have some YouTube tutorials that you can take advantage of after this class too. We do lives every Saturday, 11 a.m. Mountain Time, on a variety of topics, and today we're going to be tackling some ocean-themed, beachy type landscapes today. So I'm going to put some of these to the side because we're not going to be doing any of these exactly, but those are kind of the inspiration for today. And we're going to to start taping these down. Now, I like to work small, as I mentioned a minute ago, but in case anybody is just joining, I find that working small enables you to do a couple different paintings so that if you mess up on one, you still have some other ones. And also, they seem to be a little easier to master some of the techniques with this. I always tape mine down to either this is cardboard, these are some MDF or hardboards, so that I can hold them and control the direction that the water is actually flowing. I'll be taping down quite a few different pieces today because I like to work on a whole bunch of stuff so I can show a bunch of different things in one class. And then also because I'm impatient and I don't want to subject you guys to the hairdryer, it enables me to wait for things to dry before I move on them. This is just normal masking tape. So you're going to need some masking tape, some paper. I'm going to be using a round brush, mostly just this size 12, but whatever size you like to use. I do recommend just finding a good round brush you like using in one size and using that for most of your paintings. You also want something to tape it down and 2 cups of water so that you've got a fresh source as well as one to wash things off with, and then maybe some paper towels. I am very impatient. Yes, I don't like waiting for things. It's something I am always working on, but, you know, it's kind of how I am. As I mentioned, if you are impatient like me, but you don't want to do all of the same ones I'm doing and you don't want to have to wait, you can go ahead and grab a hairdryer. And you can use a hairdryer to dry your layers faster. Just make sure there's no standing water. So the tape bleeding is something that I'm not entirely sure why it happens. Sometimes just when it gets too saturated, it starts to kind of lift that tape up, but just make sure that it's really pressed down. You might want to consider a different type of tape. I don't have that problem too often, and when I do have it, it's because I have not pressed it down enough. You want to be careful though when you're pressing it down so that you don't get the oil from your hands onto this. So you might want to use something like the edge of a paintbrush to actually push those down really well, or a toothpick. Thank you so much for the help. There we go. I'm just going to keep taping down a few more so that we've got a few to work on, as well as I have to kind of tape them down in a way where you're going to be able to see them a little bit easier. Thank you very much. I love the help with the additional tips. It also helps me keep track of the comments and things, so thank you. And the neater that you put this tape down, the nicer they will look at the end, just because they make a nice little border that I think kind of turns it into a little bit of a like Polaroid-esque type look, which I just think is really cute. So there is a comment in here, how, I think it's directed to me, but how did I get interested in art? I've always been pretty interested in art. I like making things with my hands. For a while, I was a business person, and I did marketing, and I did that to be kind of creative, but the part that I really missed was actually having something physical at the end that I could touch and feel. So I've always been really drawn to that, but I do have a very talented grandmother who paints just, I mean, she does oil still paintings that are absolutely stunning. And she used to do calligraphy and things, so I used to spend a lot of time up in her art room with her, in her little attic art room. But I've always wanted to. I was also an only child, and I lived out on a farm, or I also lived out in the country. My dad had a farm, and then my mom lived out in the country, and there weren't a lot of things to do or people around to entertain me, so one of the ways was art. And I just find it very relaxing and satisfying. Alright, so we're going to be doing some similar sky type things. I might tape some more down in a little bit, but we're going to start there so we can actually get started and you don't have to watch me tape things the whole time. I'm going to start with these 5, and we're going to start by doing some of the skies, because I like to do my skies first so that they can kind of define the shapes of everything else for most of these. Some of these we might not actually even be doing a sky, but let's start with these 2 here. Let's make some pretty skies, and let's plan out what we're actually going to make on these paintings. So on this one, I'm actually going to turn this way. And on this one, I want to do just a very simple, I'm going to split this basically in half. The top part's going to be a really pretty sunset, and the bottom part is going to be kind of a deep blue ocean that also reflects a little bit of the sky colors throughout it. So let's start by mixing up some pretty sunset colors. Now again, in case you missed this, we always want to have 2 cups of water. And then you also, or at least one way to transfer clean water. So you can either do that with a spray bottle or a pipette to grab your water. Because whenever we're mixing up our colors, we want to make sure the water we're using is nice and clean so that we're not kind of contaminating the other colors with maybe a dirty color. The other one is going to be to wash your brush off with. Again, I'm using a size 12 brush for most of this. If you're using a dry pan palette like I am, you want to go ahead and either drip water in or spray it to just wet all the colors so that they'll be ready to go when you want to actually dip into them. All right. Another thing just to talk about brush care, I am a terrible brush owner. And I often leave my brushes in the water too long like this with watercolor, since we don't have to worry about them drying and ruining our brushes. Just try to get in the habit if you can. Don't be like me. Be like you and just set these off to the side when you're not working with them, because they'll be ready to use. You can rewash them when you actually get ready to go again, so that your brushes won't end up looking like my brushes here. So we're going to start mixing up, I want a pink and then kind of a peachy or golden yellow color. So the colors in my palette, I need to actually line these up better, but you'll just have to go with me here. And most of these are either Shinhan or Core colors. I'm going to go dip into my quinacridone magenta, which is down here, and just go ahead and put that in where I put that fresh water. Now, one more thing I forgot to mention is you always want to have a scrap piece of paper in order to test your colors, because the colors are going to look a lot different here than they actually look when you put them here. It'll be about the same, it's the same tone of the color, but it's a lot lighter than what you think it's going to be. So just make sure you kind of have some scrap paper that you can test on, or maybe if you're doing this in the sketchbook, do this on the side. Alright, so actually I really like that pink. I might not do anything else to that, but let's make kind of a nice golden type color. I'm going to grab some more clean water, and in the well next to it, I'm going to take some, first I'm going to wash my brush off because I've got magenta in there, but then I'm going to grab some of this yellow ochre. I think this has such a beautiful golden color, and I think that the yellow ochre color really complements that magenta color. If you don't have a yellow ochre, you could get something similar to this by mixing up a yellow and an orange, just a little bit of orange, and then maybe adding in some like burnt umber or burnt sienna, just a little tiny bit to just slightly change that yellow ochre color. I need a little more pigment, so I'm going to grab a little bit more of that yellow ochre color. And I also want a little more brightness, so I'm going to grab some of this permanent yellow deep and mix that in here. I like to mix up colors by adding little bits of pigment at a time just so I can make small adjustments. I think maybe even just a little more of that permanent yellow deep. It kind of allows me to hone in on a color. There we go. That's kind of the color I want. This almost reminds me of mustard, but in a good way. Alright, so as I said before, this first one is going to just be sky and ocean, and it's going to be cut about in half. So I want to do this first gradient, and we're going to be doing the drip line technique gradient, which is a nice flat fill, but you change colors halfway down. But we want to stop it about halfway down. So the first thing I'm going to do is take my round brush. I've washed it to make sure that there's no pigment in there. I'm going to load that brush up with this magenta color in my brush until it's about ready to drip out, but not quite. Then I'm going to make a horizontal stripe right along the top part. Ooh, I need some more. I'm going to make a second one where I just grab that drip line, and we want that nice line of water that starts to fall down there. I'm going to do one more horizontal stripe before I start dipping slowly into this yellow color. We want to gradually change this color out, so you want to just dip just the tip of your brush in a little bit at a time. Maybe one more. And that's where I'm going to end my sky for this painting. So the next thing I'm going to do is I don't want that standing water. So I'm going to actually dry my brush off. And then these round brushes are really good for sucking up extra pigment. They're almost like little syringes. So we're just going to suck up that extra water at the base because we don't want to let that sit there. If we let it sit, it would have some blooming effects, which can have really neat effects, but that's just not what I'm going for currently. So I'm going to suck up that extra water. Now, if I wanted to add a little bit more hint of the actual sun, while this is still wet, I can dip in to my permanent yellow deep, and while this is still wet, I can touch just right at the horizon to really hint to this is where the sun is setting, right here, right below the horizon. So that's going to be my first sky for my kind of beachy themed painting. I'm going to let this dry before I actually really get into the water part of this, but just so that I don't accidentally touch into some of the wet areas and have it bleed pink or another color up into there. So let's actually, while we're waiting for that to set and dry a little bit, let's do the same thing over here, but let's get a little bit more bold and vibrant with our colors. So I'm going to start on this. I think I'm going to come about 2/3 of the way down on this little square. And I'm going to start with filling up my brush. Wow, my brush with this magenta color. And I'm going to swipe across. We're going to do another drip line technique, but I'm going to immediately start changing over little bits at a time to this yellow. Oh, I don't think I'm holding that in front of the camera. Sorry about that. And then we're actually going to work really quick. I'm going to stop that here, grab that extra water at the base of this, and I'm going to go straight into that magenta just to get some of that pure pigment. And while it's wet, I want to add in some hints to maybe some reflections on these clouds from the sunset. And you want to work quick so that it'll be kind of nice and smooth, and just hint to the fact that maybe there are some clouds. Maybe tap and swipe in a few areas. And I like the general shape of that, so that's where I'll stop. You don't have another paper, that's all right. You can just kind of, we will be moving back and forth between different paintings. So yeah, I do a few so that you can kind of see a bunch of different ways to do this. So this is kind of my second sky here. There was also another question about the brush. I recommend just finding a round brush that you like. I think that like a size 10 is a really good universal, or a size 12 brush. 12 is a little bit big, but 10 will let you do pretty much everything you want. And I generally think that the Taklon bristles are better for beginners because they do move nice, but they don't have way too much movement, so that I think they're easier to learn some of the techniques on. And just go based on, yeah, what your budget is, you know. It's better to find one brush you like than a whole bunch of little ones you don't like. This one has dried enough to move back over to here. So I'm going to start suggesting kind of the reflections. I want to build some layers into here where I'm going to actually put some of these colors reflected in the water. So let's actually grab a little bit of this magenta color here. And then we don't want, let me find my tester paper. If I went in at this point, right after I put my brush in here, I'm not going to be able to get super thin lines because I've got too much pigment in my water, or in my brush. So I'm going to just tap my brush off over to the side on my paper towel to remove just a little bit, so that it's not quite a dry brush, but it's going to allow me to get thinner lines because I don't have quite as much pigment in there. All right, so I've got the pink in here. I have reduced the amount of pigment in it by a little bit. And I want to actually look at where the sky is. In general, this peachy or yellow color is going to be reflected up until about here, and then it will start to be reflecting more of that magenta color. So we're going to take just the tip of our brush and we're just going to make a few lines. You don't want these to completely touch. You want to vary kind of the pressure and the weight to maybe indicate that there is some movement in the water, and you want to leave some white space. The more white space that you can leave, the more magical that this will look, and it will actually look like there is reflections on the water. So I'm just going to start by just adding that in for the pink. I'm going to wash my brush off. And now I'm going to do the same thing for that yellow. So I'm going to load my brush up. I'm going to tap it off so that it's not too wet. And now I'm going to put that same technique here, but I'm going to try to make the lines even smaller and thinner because they're further away, to reflect more of that water and more of the color that's in the sky. Oops, I touched two of those together. That's all right. And we might want to also concentrate a little bit more of that reflection right here where that sun is. Make sure you actually emphasize where the sun is setting with the yellow. Great. Let's do the same things over here. I still have a little bit of yellow in my brush over here, so I'm going to do the same thing on this one, but I'm going to start with the yellow. And we're going to be putting some blues over these, but we want to make sure that we at least have some layers and hints to these colors that are already in the sky being reflected throughout. So I put a little bit of that yellow there. And then the way that I have set up this composition is that it goes 2/3 of the way down. So we're not actually going to see all of that pink reflected here. That pink might actually be reflected more down here out of sight, except for where these really bright clouds are. So let's wash our brush off and put in some hints to kind of where those clouds would be reflected there. I'm going to actually go straight into this color here, which is the straight magenta with a little bit less water in it. Tap my brush off so that it's pretty dry, but not totally dry. And I'm going to kind of think about these shapes and how they would be reflected in the opposite direction. And just put a little bit of that color. I could actually use a little bit more pigment there. It's going to be down here a little bit. Again, make sure you leave some white space. The white space is kind of what creates the magical reflections. This is watercolor. All right, now we want to actually add some blues in. So I'm going to take a little corner of my paper towel and actually wipe up this area just so I have a nice clean area in my palette. I'm going to put a little bit of water here, clean water. And then I want more of a teal blue, so blues that are maybe a little bit more green leaning, which is going to help with the yellows that are already going to be in this. It'll be a little bit more complementary. So I'm going to start by grabbing some cerulean blue, which is not technically a teal, but it's kind of a nice light tropical blue. Let's just look at what that looks like. Then I'm going to dip into a viridian green, just a little bit of it. I think I put too much on my brush, so I'm going to tap that off over on the other side because I want this to be a little bit of a subtle effect. There we go. That's the green that I want. So that's cerulean and viridian green. And again, same thing. We want to tap our brush off because we don't want too much in here. We're not doing a dry brushing technique necessarily. We're just trying to make sure there's not too much water. And then I'm going to start to do the same thing, but I'm going to put this all throughout here, this nice teal color. And I'm actually going to also make sure I concentrate some of my strokes right around the horizon line, because typically that horizon line kind of has a little bit more definition to it. Vary the length, vary the width, and make it a little bit more deep and concentrated the further you go down and away from that sun, because that would be darker down there. Leave some white space. We'll be doing this a few times with a couple different colors. And just be real light. This is a really hard, well, at least for me, this was really hard. And I do see some people really struggling with being light and leaving that white space. So if you're struggling right now, understand that you're not alone, and this skill will become easier with practice. Okay, we're going to do the same thing over here with this color. I'm going to put a little more in, but I'm also going to tap it off because I was getting a little bit light there. And then again, the same thing. I'm going to make some longer strokes that are kind of thin towards the horizon, and then get a little bit thicker and choppier as I get further away from that. And see, we still have some of those reflections of that color from the sky, but we're still getting the blues. Let's add in another blue to both of these, and let's make it a little bit darker, maybe a little more purpley. So let's grab a little bit of this color we mixed up and just put it over into another well. And then, since we've already got some of the magentas going, let's actually just put a little magenta into this to turn it a little bit more blue-purple. There we go. I like that color a lot. And it is okay if you go over the other colors. Some bleeding is nice. Make sure you don't get too much bleeding. If you made your strokes too much and there isn't enough room for you to add colors and it's too wet, just wait for a minute before you do these steps and just let them soak in, because then you'll at least get some pretty layering effects. And yes, so I'm trying to pick colors that are at least going to be pretty complementary and not totally ruin the total effects of everything we're going for, so that we can go over some of them. So yes, go ahead and do that. I've taken a little bit of my lighter blue color, and then I put it into this well. I added some magenta, tapped off my brush, and now I'm going to do the same thing. I'm trying not to go over the exact same strokes. Some of these are overlapping, but they are not the exact same strokes. And I also want to avoid a little bit more around where that sun is, because we want that to be a lighter area in general. So maybe avoid touching in there more. And you can see I'm just making real small, quick strokes, but I'm still leaving a little bit of that white to reflect. And I'm moving between these two paintings so that I can let these soak in a little bit, so that some of them bleed, but some of them it's just going to layer on top of. And again, let's do the same thing over here. I'm also trying to concentrate some of that color right along the horizon line so that I get a real nice defined horizon line. I just think it looks a little bit nicer when you do that. But that's a personal preference for me. And then I want to make this one a little bit darker. So we're going to keep it, here is the general color of it right now. I'm going to put in a teeny amount of this ultramarine blue, which will darken this a little bit, but maybe a little more ultramarine and a little more of that quinacridone magenta. Let's see what color that is. That's a nice color, but I think I need a little more blue, so I'm going to grab a little bit more of that ultramarine. There we go. It's a little bit more blue. Again, working back and forth here. And on this one, I'm going to really start to concentrate these colors everywhere, but kind of in this area. I'm only going to slightly move into that just to kind of hint to maybe there's a little bit of a wave there or something. Trying to darken everything but that area where where's that real reflection is. And this is going to start to give that effect. Hi Angie, and happy birthday! Have any fun plans today? Alright, moving over to this one. Again, grabbing a little bit of that pigment. See, I have barely any water in there. We're just putting a little bit of pigment in there at a time. You just want to do this until you feel happy with these. I would like to do a little bit more on this. I'm going to brighten it up just a little bit by putting a little bit of that cerulean hue into it. And I'm going to do another layer, and again I'm going to go pretty much everywhere but where that sun reflection is. If you feel like you've lost some of the colors from the sky, you can wash your brush off and dry it. And you can also add a second layer of maybe that pink to reflect in here. And just tap your brush off and add in a little bit more of that pink maybe if you wanted to make sure you really got some of those colors in there. So this is the first technique that we're going to be doing with water. We're going to do a couple techniques with water here today. So if you struggled with this one, it's fine. Maybe just need a little more practice with it. But we might have another technique that will work better for you. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to add a little more of that yellow into some of these areas too. And there, they're really, really simple little water paintings here, but let's actually move on to some other techniques. So for this one, we're going to actually make more of a let's take a little more literal approach to a beach. Yes. Oh, that's another good point. I do upload these afterwards, so if you need to rewatch this because you're going to brunch or whatever you're doing today, this will be on my YouTube in a day or two. All right. So let's actually take a more you know, realistic approach to some water here. And we're going to start again with our skies, and let's do just a nice blue for our skies. So we'll do that on all three of these. I'm going to put a little bit more water in this one, and I'm going to use this blue that I have here that I did it for my other ocean as kind of a base for my sky color. I like that cerulean color. It really does feel kind of tropical to me, and so it makes nice clouds or nice skies. Let's add a little bit more. I want mine to be a little darker. You can make your sky colors however you want them to be, but I'm mainly doing cerulean blue with whatever little bits of color that was left over from our previous colors. Okay, so let's make a plan here on these three. Actually, I think I'll do 2 in this way, and then I'll do 2 in the other. We're going to do a reflective way too. But let's do one that's just going to be beach and ocean. So I'm going to make sky and then ocean with a little beach here. So let me find my pencil so I can kind of mark on my tape. The sky for this one is going to come only about 1/3 of the way down, and then I'm not going to actually draw on here because I don't like to draw on mine, so I don't have to try to cover everything. But in general, I am going to make this area over here is going to be kind of a beachy color, so the ocean is going to take up about this area here. So we're going to start with our sky, going down to where I made those marks. I'm going to use this blue, and I'm going to use my drip line technique where I fill this up. I brush up with my blue color. Oops, that was not a great stroke. And just move this stroke down until I get to that line I made. Then dry my brush off and suck up the extra water. And then let's do the same thing for this one. Although this one, I want to put maybe some hints to some greenery around, kind of similar to this here. So I'm going to bring this one down just above the halfway point, the sky. Our greenery will actually go, let's actually take it to halfway. Our greenery will go up to about the 2/3 way. So let's do the same thing. We're going to do the same sky here. Load our brush up. If you want to add some clouds, you can use the paper towel technique where you blot them off to remove that pigment. Oh, I thought I was going to sneeze. Sorry. I might sound a little stuffy today because my allergies are in high gear today. Whew. Anybody else struggling with allergies right now? There we go. Sucking up that extra water at the bottom. So these look pretty boring right now, but we're going to make them a little bit more fun. So we need to let those dry though before we can add in any of our other elements. And my skies are going to stay that color. I want my ocean to again be that kind of really pretty teal color. So I'm going to, but I want it to be a little darker. I'm going to keep this color here, and I'm going to add a little bit more of that cerulean to it just to add a little more pigment. And then again, I'm going to grab a little of that Viridian green to turn this more into a teal type color as kind of my base color for the ocean. I want to bump that up a little bit more because I want enough contrast to really be able to tell the difference between the sky and the ocean. So let's add a little bit more of each of those pigments into this color. And then for the darker blue, because usually ocean, when you look out, when it's this nice, pretty tropical blue color, It really only gets that way kind of as it approaches the beach and starts to fall onto the sand. The stuff in the background is actually going to be kind of a darker, deeper blue to hint at deeper waters. So we want to also mix up a deeper watercolor. So I'm going to put a little water here. And I can start just with whatever color was in my brush because, you know, that will help transfer it through so that there's a little consistency. Then I want to actually use a, I think this is my phthalo blue. Hopefully it is because that's the color I would like. Yes, that's my phthalo blue. And I'm going to put a little phthalo blue in there because I want a darker color. And I want it to be even darker than that. So I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to add a little more phthalo blue. And I'm also going to turn it a little bit more steely by grabbing just a teeny tiny amount of orange. Just the littlest bit on just the tip of my brush. I'm going to mix that in there, and that's going to, I think I actually need a little bit more, but it will slightly darken this color and turn it a little bit more steely. Adding just a little bit at a time. It's hard to take this pigment out, so just be a little careful. So see how we went from really bright to a little bit more muted. I think that's going to be a nice contrast with this really bright teal blue here. Okay, so this one is just going to be beach over here and then the ocean over here. So we need to prepare a little bit because we have to move a little fast and we need to be able to also have access to some clean water for our brush on this. So you might want to watch me do this first. We're going to build the basis of our ocean by going dark to light to completely clear over here, well, or as clear as we can get it. Usually when I talk about making my gradients, I talk about just slowly interchanging the water, and we're going to change that up a little bit. So you might want to watch how I do this before diving in, because there's a little bit different timing and a little bit different technique than what I normally do on this. So I'm going to wash my brush because I don't remember what color I have in it. And then I'm going to put some of this really dark blue color in here, and I'm going to start in this corner where the sky meets this white area with the dark color, and I'm just going to make kind of a little triangle area here. This is where I want my darkest color to be. Then I'm actually going to take my brush and I'm going to dip it off onto my rag that's off screen before putting a decent amount of this teal, because I actually want this to transition pretty quick. And then I'm going to add in a little bit more of this teal color as I move out. And I actually have enough to where I can pretty much take most of that there. And let's do one more little round here, and then I'm going to completely wash my brush off. And while this is still wet, I'm going to grab this and just pull this out. That's going to give that nice, we might have to do this a couple times, but it's going to give a nice subtle transition to kind of hint to the fact that the water starts to actually kind of trickle over the beach here. And I want that to go up a little bit higher over here. So I'm gonna try to fib this a little bit, and it's not working super great, but that's okay. So the paper was dry underneath, yes. And it's alright if we get a few of these blooming effects. Maybe actually let's lean into this. If you're having trouble and it's starting to dry a little bit, you can take your damp brush and kind of tap along the edges of this, and it will give us some variation in the water there. We're going to add more layers to this, so if your first layer isn't perfect, like mine, mine is not perfect, it's fine. We'll work on it. So let's leave that to dry for just a minute before we go over here. Now this is the one where we're going to have a little greenery. I'm going to add the greenery at the end. The greenery is going to come up to here and then kind of swoop around this way. But we're going to do a similar thing with the ocean, so we have a second shot here. So again, I'm going to start with this dark blue over in this corner. I'm going to tap my brush off and then load it with the teal color. This is on dry paper. I'm going to bring that out. And then I'm going to wash my brush off And then with a damp brush, I'm going to just kind of soften the edge and that transition between where there is going to be sand over here and then the water is right here. If you want to bring yours out a little further, you can do that while it's still wet. I want mine to be a little bit further here. Again, I'm going to wash my brush, and then with my damp brush, I'm going to just touch to soften the edges of that. So the teal I'm using is cerulean blue plus a little viridian. But a phthalo blue would look nice too. I need to actually, just one second, I need to blow my nose so I'm not sniffling. Sorry about that. That sneeze that tried to get me was about to take me out. All right, so let's look at what we've got here. In general, my beach kind of goes up here, which isn't ideal, but that's okay. We're going to lean into that. First thing I want to do is I actually really like the blooming that's happening here. So my papers are about 4 by 3 and 3 by 3, or actually this one I think is 3.5 by 2.5. But I really like this blooming effect. It kind of reminds me of right where you get that, the water starts to get the white caps or the white foam as it hits the sand. So the other thing we need to do is actually create some sand color. Maybe before we actually even work on the water some more. Let's go ahead and do that. That way if you're impatient and you want to work on your water on your own in a minute, you can do that. I'm going to turn this around because I need a little bit more space. So for my sand, you know, sand is different colors everywhere, but I'm going to go for kind of a beigey type sand. So I'm going to grab, I think this is my burnt sienna. I'm just going to put a little bit of that there, a little bit of that burnt sienna here. And let's just see what that color looks like when it's nice and watered down. It's a little bit too brown for me, so I'm going to add in a little bit of, I think this one's red ochre. And I think I'm going to have gone a little bit too far in the other direction. But if we really, really wet that down, what's that color look like? It's a little better. Maybe a little bit of yellow ochre. Just a little bit. Oop, I got a little green in there. And I gotta flip over. I've used a lot of my paper here. Here, I can grab another test strip here. A little bit too light, maybe a little bit more yellow ochre. And that's a nice kind of base for the sand color. So, similar to what we did on the layer for the ocean, we're going to work in the other direction. If you have trouble with this, you can actually change the direction that you hold your paper, which is one of the reasons why I like to work on something like this, is I can do it in a way where it's going to help me. So I'm going to start by loading up just a little bit of that sand color, and I'm just going to stroke right here on the edge of the paper before I wash my brush off, and then take a damp brush and just soften the edge kind of along where that would meet there. It's going to give us a little bit of that sand type color. If you want a little more concentration in certain areas, you can tap that in, and since you've already kind of wet between those two areas where they are going to meet, it will help a little bit. I'm going to grab a little more yellow ochre and just dab that in a few areas. I want to just give a little variation of color. We can get a little bit closer, but I do like to try to keep more separation between where the blue and the sand are, because it kind of creates that whitish area that would be there. Okay, so now we've got kind of the ocean area, which I'm going to add at least one more layer on, probably maybe two, but now we also have our defined kind of sand area. Let's do the same thing to this one here. I'm going to make my sand right here, wash my brush while this is still, this part's wet, but the other part isn't. I'm going to soften those edges. If I want to add some more colors, maybe a little more like yellow ochre, I can do that to put some variation. We just want to make sure that the yellow isn't so much touching that blue color. So I'm just tapping into some water and then encouraging everything to flow in the direction of the water, but not completely get there. Creating a little water barrier in between the two so that we have some of that seafoam area. So for these, we're just kind of making them up. I think of these as more like little snapshots, like memories from maybe a beach vacation or even just a video you watched of the beach. Okay. Let's go back in and add some more detail to the water on this top one. So a little bit similar to what we did in the first step, we want to give a little motion. We want to add a little bit of movement and ripples in the water. But our water perspective has changed a little bit. So rather than all the ripples being kind of horizontal, they would tend to kind of move along the edge of the shoreline. So we want our ripples to at least kind of be at this angle over here. So I'm going to flip this back over because I do have my dark color and I have my teal blue color. And I want to show you something here that's happening on my palette that you can actually use to your advantage. So do you notice how the puddles of the real mixed up colors that I've watered down with water are right here, but then is kind of this dried area of the pigment that is, well, it's pretty dry. I mean, it's a little bit wet, but it's more concentrated technically, and you can actually get a couple different effects using the different areas of here. So if I were to take I want to put in some of these ripples with all these colors. If I were to take straight from the actual watered area and tap my brush off so I don't have way too much, and then I added some different lines in here, it's going to have a different look. Then if I were to wash my brush off, dry it off, and then grab some of this pigment here, it's going to have a little bit more concentration and be a little bit easier to actually get the color that you want. And you can even find areas where maybe there's a little more blue separating out from the color so that you can vary it a little bit at a time. And again, we want this to be a little bit darker towards the darker, deeper ocean that's over here. If I'm not super happy with how your ripples look, you can wash your brush off and soften some of those edges. Because like right now I'm not super crazy about how some of those are, but I want to leave some of that movement here. So I'm just going to soften some of those edges. And maybe I'll wait for this to dry just a second, wash my brush off. And you can tell when things are ready for bloom effects if you find a light source. See how we can see the reflection there? And in some areas it's a little bit too shiny and almost drippy. It's not quite ready. We want this to just be starting to mattify. So we want to be able to see like a tiny sheen with a little bit of a tiny reflection. But you want to be able to really see the texture of the paper coming through. You can see it up there. And I've got a damp brush here, and now at this point, if I drop this in, it's going to repel some of those pigments and create some neat effects that might kind of help us look a little bit like white caps. You can start to see some of those develop a little bit. Before this dries too much, I'm going to put a little bit more of that dark color right along the backside because I don't feel like that's coming through super well. And that's a little better. We're going to have to do another layer on that in a minute, but let's give this one kind of a similar treatment here. I'm going to grab just a little bit of that dark color, and again I'm going to kind of put that here. grab some of that teal without washing my brush or anything so that they kind of blend together. And just make some little motions that are going to kind of indicate the movement of that water. If I want, I can also wash my brush and kind of make that a little bit more of a subtle transition by pulling out that area. I definitely touched them together a little bit too much over here, so you can see they all bled together. So I want to be patient and wait for a minute there. All right, I need to actually kind of let those sit for a second before I do anything more to them. So I'm going to tape down another one that I want to do because I want to do some reflection stuff. And I'm going to do it on this one as well as one more. So I'm just going to let this chill out for a second before I start messing with it anymore so I can actually get some more defined brush strokes on there. And this is just, this is a backing board from a print that I misframed on accident. You can use pretty much anything to tape your stuff to. You can get some of that chipboard, you can find pieces of cardboard. What do I put my paintings on when I'm finished? I do a couple things with them. Sometimes you can frame them individually. Sometimes you can frame it in a nice mat. You can also put them in floating frames, which I think is really lovely. Oh, thank you. I do try. I feel like I'm struggling a little bit today, especially with my allergy nose, but, you know, we're going to muddle through it. All right. Let's hope that, nope, see that is still, I thought that was going to be dry enough, but can you see just a little glint? There's still quite a bit of water there. And there's too much water over here to actually add the greenery because it would really bleed into the water, and that's not the effect that I want to demonstrate on this one. So we're actually going to move over to this one, and we're going to do a little bit of a reflective type painting. It's been a while since I've done one of these, so hopefully I can remember how I do this. But in this one, we actually want to make kind of some rocky type structures here. You could even maybe do some of my little mountains. We'll do that on one of those. But we're going to do, I might not even do a sky on this one. I might just lean into the reflections of the water and the rocks and things like that so we can see what that looks like. When the tape peels the paper, is that because it's not good quality paper? No, it's just that the adhesive is a little too tough. If you need to remove the tape, use a hair dryer. It will heat up the tape and it actually releases that adhesive so you can peel it off without it tearing it. So don't worry, it's not your paper. It's just needs a little more finesse and a little more care. I've done that a ton. All right, so let's put a nice big rock kind of over here, maybe thinking kind of Morro Bay type of a thing. We're going to start by doing something that we don't usually do in my class, which is we're going to be dipping a lot into the pigments directly. So I'm going to just kind of take this side, the quick mixing side of this, and this is going to be dry paper. I'm going to wash my brush because I don't remember what colors are in it. And then I'm actually going to start by using some of this Payne's Gray, which is also not something I typically do, but ooh, I got way too much of that. Let's wash our brush off. There's too much going on. We just want this to be a little bit gray in our brush, so if I were to make a stroke on here, we're going to adjust this. We just want it to be a nice light gray for this kind of rock formation here. So the class started at 11, but we are starting a new technique right now, so feel free to jump right in and you can at least learn one of the techniques. I'm using 140-pound paper. All right, so let's make just kind of a general rock shape to start with. you can make it a little bit kind of rocky. That's the technical term. I'm going to bring this out kind of over here, and then maybe there's a second one here. The goal of this one is we're going to be creating some reflections. So my general rock shapes are here, and while those are still wet, I'm going to kind of go straight into some of these pure pigments and just touch to give them a little variation, to make them have a little bit of depth where they've got some darker areas and some lighter areas. And let's make this rock be right here. And if you concentrate the color, especially while this is still wet, along the bottoms of these, it'll kind of give the illusion of some shadowing, which can be really nice. And let's just make some rocks. These are very impressionistic rocks. You can do a different color rock if you want, but I like to add in a little bit more dark to certain areas to show the shadows and maybe the cracks of the rock. And you want to do this while the paper is still a little wet so that it will kind of flow a little bit. It's okay if it dries a little bit too much, because rocks have some harsh kind of shapes on them too. It's fine. All right, so here's our big stones that are in our water. Now, first thing we can do if we want to do just kind of a reflective type water is, while this is still just barely damp, we can take our brush, wash it off, and take some water that's on there and just pull this down a little bit. It's going to initially start grabbing some of that, hello, and it's going to just pull that down. It's going to start some of those reflections. Then if we wanted to actually reflect those a little bit more, then while now this bottom part is still wet, we can actually come in here and kind of recreate the general shapes of these to create the reflections. And while this is nice and wet, it's going to actually kind of reflect these nicely. Wash our brush off if we need to, and kind of tap in certain areas if that has not flowed all the way down. And I'm just using the Payne's Gray for this one for now. I don't know if I want to add any other colors. Maybe we will. We'll have to wait and see. I'm going to touch right along the base of this again with the Payne's Gray, just to give more of that reflection, or the shadow, which, since this is nice and wet here, is going to kind of bleed into the wet part. And I'm going to kind of try to emulate the general shape of that rock from above. But that's going to create kind of a nice, soft reflection of something like rock. So this is another technique you can use for water. Let's move back over to these ones here. I'm going to wash my brush off really well because I've got Payne's Gray in it. I don't want that in my nice, super bright, beachy colors. And for this one, I'm going to try to be a little bit more careful. With actually making sure I tap my brush off to be a little drier so I can get some smaller actual brush strokes in here. And these should be dry enough to where they're not going to actually bleed together. We'll see. One way you can test is, one, if your paper has started to settle back down, typically it becomes a little convex from where it goes out. Once it settles down and is flatter again, that's usually when you can tell that it is a little bit drier. The other thing you can do, rather than just touching it, is kind of hover your wrist over. Your wrist is a really sensitive area. That's why people test things like baby bottles on them. But if you feel a lot of coolness coming towards your wrist, you'll know that it's still really wet, even if it looks like it's dry. Now, I don't feel a ton here, so I do feel a little, but I think it's enough to where I can move on with this. So again, I'm taking my darker blue, tapping off my brush, and I'm gonna try, this one I've been struggling with, but make my little tiny reflections where I don't actually touch everything, and I've already gone a little bit too much on parts of that, but I'm doing a little better job. Let's go ahead and just do the same on this one because I was struggling on this one too. And again, I'm trying to move a little bit more in the direction that the beach is following. I'm going to tap my brush off and grab some of this drier pigment here on the side of my teal. And then I'm going to do kind of the same thing here where I'm just going to touch in lightly to create some little ripples in there. Same thing down here. And I want my darker part to be a little darker, so I'm going to try to add in a little bit more of that pigment here right at the base, or the edge of the ocean. And maybe even hint to it kind of in a few areas, because sometimes that transition is a little bit rough in the ocean where there's a real dark area and then it gets a little bit light, but then it drops back off again. So maybe we put a little extra kind of deep shelf in a few areas. And this is not my favorite beachy painting I've done, but that's kind of the general concept behind this. Now, let's play a hypothetical situation. We're still going to add in our greenery on this one, but let's play a hypothetical situation on this other one that you might be experiencing. I gotta grab a different color over here. But let's say that you had trouble preserving kind of this white space here that is going to hint to kind of the sea foam and where the waves crash onto it. Here's how you fix that. So you can take a white gouache or a white watercolor. I've got this Prang set here that's got a pretty good white in it. I'm just gonna wet that a little bit. Oh, nice. Yeah, I'll have to check it out. What's the brand? So here's how we would correct that, is we would dip into this white, and white gouache can help us correct a lot of our mistakes. It can also help us add some highlights back into the water. So we're going to actually put a bunch of this white gouache, and white gouache is still a little transparent, so you're going to need a decent amount in your brush. And then I'm going to actually just kind of scribble this along the edge here to create some of that sea foam. And this will help you if maybe you want to just re-emphasize some of the white areas, or maybe you had trouble maintaining that. It will help just kind of add a little bit in here. So feel free to add that. You can also tap your brush off so that you just have little bits on there. And then you can also just add in some reflections at this point too. If like me, you had a hard time keeping that white space, this can sometimes save you. I know there are some watercolor teachers who really want you to avoid using white gouache. And in general, if you can learn how to not have to use it, it can help you a lot. But, you know, after you've spent a bunch of time on something, I don't think that you should feel guilty about putting a little extra highlight onto something. Sometimes it can really help. Gallo colors, huh? I'll have to look at those. I've got quite a few different watercolors that I'm in the process of testing. You'll have to let me know what you thought of the Paul Rubens ones. I thought that they had some really pretty metallic pigments. Plus, I just really like the packaging of them. Alright, so let's add in some greenery to this one. And then we're also going to... First, let's actually start by adding our nice blue sky onto this, because we're going to do my mountain one, but we're going to do a similar technique to this one. But we're going to do mountains that are reflecting into that. And let's actually start by putting in a sky, just so we have a nice sky. And let's use our nice sunset colors we did before. So we're going to grab our pink color. And I can already tell you this one's going to bleed a little bit more. I did not bleed under the paper. I did not put a good coat there. So I'm going to do 2 strokes of the pink before I start to transition over to that yellow. And I'm only going to go about halfway down on this paper before I dry my brush. Suck up the extra water. And let that dry while I start messing with my greenery on my second painting. So for the greenery, I'm going to kind of put a little green hill here that's going to kind of just cut off a little bit of this beach. And I'm going to wash my brush. And I'm going to do this mainly by dipping straight into these different pigments. So let's start. I usually like to start with, I think this is a olive green. And I'm just going to put some of my little hills here and put that. Imagine that that's a hill there. And that sticks out just a little bit. Just to add a little greenery onto this. Now, I'm picking up a little bit extra of this color and this water that is sitting here because I don't want it to just run crazy, and I want to encourage this to soak in a little bit because I want to control where the colors are going to go at least a little bit. Because the first thing I want to do is actually take some of this Viridian green. I'm dipping straight just the tip of my brush into this, so there's just a little bit on there. And then right along the base of this, I'm going to tap in here. And since this is still wet, this is going to kind of nice and seep in. You can also emphasize maybe if you have a little valley here, and that will help create some interest in your hills. We can let that sit. We can revisit that in a minute. Or you can leave it like that, depending on what you like. Alright, this one needs to dry just a little bit more before I can add my mountains. But what we can do is we can actually mix up our mountain colors. If you haven't taken one of my classes before, when we are doing our mountains, we actually want to mix up our darkest color first, even though we're going to use it last. So the question is, do I prep my paper first? The only thing I do to prep my paper is cut it and tape it down. There are a lot of different ways that you can prep paper. I don't see a big enough difference in prepped paper for my impatience. But if you like it and you enjoy the process of doing it, absolutely go for it. All right, so I'm gonna cannibalize this blue color that I used in my other ocean scenes, but I want to darken it, so I'm going to grab more of that phthalo blue, and I'm going to put in a little bit more of that orange as well, because I want these to be kind of steely type colored. I'm going to need some more. Wash my brush before I tap into my orange again. I might have gotten a little bit too much, and this might be a little bit too, yep, more like a gray-black. So I need to add a little bit more of that phthalo blue to help balance that. I went a little bit too far to one side. It happens. Let's add just a little bit more of that phthalo blue. There we go. That's more the color I wanted, was kind of a nice steely blue color. Then I'm going to take part of my paper towel that is now nice and soaked from all of my tapping off. And I'm going to suck up the water from this one because I want to use that well. It's transferring some over there. I'm going to put some clean water into this well. And then I have not yet washed my brush off, so it still has some of this color that is also just, we're having a really fun effect happen here in my palette, where it seems to be actively sucking water from this other well. Little science experiment happening, but we want a nice diluted version of this color. So let's just check. There we go. That's a nice diluted version of this color. And I want to do my first layer of mountains here. So I make my mountains just kind of however I want to. You can do yours in whatever shapes you want. It is nice to kind of look at what your sky is giving you to decide if you like certain areas. So maybe you want to avoid putting something there. If you dislike areas, you can put your mountains over them. And there's our first layer of mountains. Now I need to let this dry before I can move on. And I just want to, let's look at the other ones we've done so far today. First of all, I'm actually really liking this rock. There's more I could do to this, but I think I'm kind of charmed by this. I don't know. I don't know if I want to do anything more to this one. Oh, you're very welcome. And here were our other two ones that we did earlier. So if you are just joining now, I will upload this in a day or two to my YouTube so that you can follow along if you missed the first part of this. But we painted some different water type things. So we did some just general reflective sunsets onto some oceans. We did some more beachy type scenes. And then now we're working on more of a soft reflection technique similar to the rocks. Normally, again, I still am going to work on this painting here, but I need to let it dry a little bit before I add some more layers to it. So we're going to be patient by first doing this here, which is something I do not recommend you do, which is just go straight in and take this tape off. Please use a hairdryer if you like the paintings you've done so that you can release the adhesive and not rip them. But I do risk this for you guys so that we can actually get a good look at what we've painted today at the end, and you can see I'm getting a little ripping along there. I'm going to take these out while we wait for that last painting to dry. See how much ripping I'm getting on that? That's okay. You know, I save some of these paintings, and I have a little, oops, if they're not too terribly ripped, sometimes I include them as freebies, especially in orders of people who tell me that they came from TikTok because they're kind of fun little mementos, as well as I've been including some of that pinkest pink color in orders too, as a little sample. But this is my way of showing you what we did, as well as also showing you the consequences of being impatient and just taking this tape off without using the hairdryer trick. Yeah, I think these are just kind of nice little vignettes, basically. Alright, I think that this one is dry enough for me to add a second layer of mountains. Again, I'm going to just take some of this pigment and put it into the diluted one to just darken this a little bit to add a second layer of my mountains. I'm personally using masking tape. You can use a painter's tape. The same thing happens, though. The ripping does possibly happen with that, too. So just be careful. And the hairdryer really does the trick, so. I'm going to put on at least one more layer of mountains here, so I'm going to wait before I do anything else again. The other thing is to make sure that your paintings are fully dry. If they are still kind of wet when you go to take your tape off, I have found that that really increases the chances of it ripping. So you want to actually make sure that they are dry. Usually, I wait to take off my tape until maybe an hour or so after I've painted things, because sometimes the paint gets underneath the tape in these little corners. And if you wait for it to dry, then you don't have any problem. But if you take it off too early, it will sometimes make little marks from the wet paint. this one good too. I think I'm going to add a little bit more to this green while we wait for the mountains to dry enough to do our third and final layer over there. Oh, I can't take that fully off because it's partially taped to that one. But let's add a little bit more interest to these greens. Let's start with this sap green, just to add a little bit different color here. And let's put this on in a few areas here just to add a little variation. We can then take some of that viridian, touch in certain areas as well. We can wash our brush off and put some water on it and tap it to kind of soften the edges of where we put that pigment. And that will just give it a little bit more depth if you add some extra layers onto it. The other thing we might want to do on this one is we're going to want our reflection to be nice and soft, but we probably do want to hint to the fact that there is some of this pink here. So similar to what we did up here, we're going to be washing our brush and softening the edges here, but I'm going to turn this upside down, put some pink in my brush, and I'm going to wash my brush off. Tap it off so that it's just damp, and then I'm going to soften that edge, and I might need to suck up a little bit extra a few times to keep that nice and soft. We just want kind of the hint of this pink in the bottom part of this painting. Already starting to get kind of more of that reflective type look to it, but we do want to do one more layer of those mountains, and I am getting short on time, so I'm going to have to risk a little bit of something here, which is I'm going to do my third and final layer of these mountains. I would like to wait a little bit longer, but I want to make sure we can get through this, so I'm going to dry my brush off, grab some of this darker pigment, and again I'm going to add this over to this diluted one, maybe even a little bit more because I want it a little darker. Add my final layer of mountains here, or reflections. Oops, way too much water there. And I'm just putting a nice little hilly area of the mountains. I'm going to wait for just a second before I really create that reflection, because I want this to bleed in, but I want it to bleed in subtly, so I want this to start to soak into the paper a little bit before I wash my brush. I'm going to wait very impatiently for just another second. Absolutely, I will do that for sure. Alright, so I've waited impatiently. And now I have washed my brush off. It is wet, but not super duper dripping wet. And I am going to run my brush right along the edge of this and just let that start to bleed into there. I'm going to do the same thing again, make sure this whole thing gets wet. And then I can actually start to add more reflections into here by taking a little bit more of this pigment. And I can add some kind of shapes as they might be in there to create more of that kind of just reflected look to it. We can also try to emphasize right along the edge here as things dry. We want it to be dry enough to actually take this. We can take our darker color here, and it's not going to be as dark as you think because we're going to be putting it on wet, so it will automatically dilute it, but we can touch that right along kind of the division between where this water is and where the mountain is, and since things are still kind of wet, they will flow together. If you end up with too many of these kind of fingerlings because you added it, that's a little bit too early for me, you can come in here and just lightly touch to kind of encourage them to flow out. And that will help you make kind of a nice soft reflection of what's happening in the other part of the painting. One last thing I would do is wait for this to dry and then make a really nice line across here. We'll see if this dries enough while I'm showing you the other ones. and taking off the tape of these ones as well. So let's go ahead and do that so that you can see all the ones we did, and then maybe I'll have a chance to add that horizon line in there. So I'm going to go ahead and take these off, and you can see this one's probably still too wet to have taken that off, but I'm doing it. Living on the edge here. Here's one of them. That white gouache does, or white watercolor does take a while for it to dry. I've noticed way more than other ones. I'll bring each one in individually in a minute, but let's take the tape off of this one and this one too, and will that other one to dry. In time. So as we wrap things up here, now is a good time if you have additional questions, because I do have just a few more minutes where you can ask some questions if you have additional questions. The other thing I always like to mention is I do love to see what you make, so feel free to make a video and tag me here on TikTok, or you can send them to me through Instagram, either at Lacey Walker Art or at Rebel Unicorn Crafts. I need to make myself a new sign because I keep dripping water on it, but either of those places, there are links in my bio to get to at least one or two of those places. I do also have a YouTube account that you can see different art tests as well as a few different tutorials if you want a little extra something to do. And I also do upload all of these videos that I do here. Sure. So yeah, that's something I can add to the list. If you've got recommendations, please let me know. Sometimes I do lose my list because I am a little bit spacey, which is perfect since my name is Lacey and I can be spacey Lacey. But if I haven't gotten to something and I said I was considering it, just ask me again. I'm happy to keep considering it. So here is one of them. If you want to screenshot that one. You've done each of my tutorials? Oh, that's so nice. I'm so excited by that. I need to make more. I know that I've been working on some other stuff behind the scenes that has been taking my time, so hopefully that will be out there soon, but I still have a little bit of a wait to go on that. And hopefully I'll have some more time to actually make some more tutorials that aren't just TikTok. TikTok ones are super easy and I can kind of do those. Or they're easier than the YouTube ones. So here's one. There's the rocks. Here's another one if you want to screenshot this one. And here, let me actually bring these a little bit closer. If you are doing the screenshots, I will wait for just a second here. An underwater scene painting. I would need to practice that for a little bit. I don't know if I've done much underwater stuff. Okay, here is another one, and you can do, I've got a little tutorial, if you struggled with the clouds on this, one of my first 3-minute long video on my TikTok actually shows how to do this in real time, so if you need to be able to watch it a few times and get kind of the clouds that bleed into a nice peachy sunset, there is already a little tutorial for you there. Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you for the suggestion. So they're saying neon. Whenever the screen names go together, I have a hard time. My brain says it right, and then my mouth does not. Anyways, there is somebody tagged on here for an amazing underwater tutorial, so that's perfect. Thank you. Yeah, there are so many good watercolor tutorials out there that YouTube you can really learn to paint. Alright, I am going to try to add a horizon line to this one. So I'm going to go, before I show you the other one, sorry I know you were screenshotting, but I'm getting distracted. I'm going to grab a little bit of that dark color, make my brush pretty dry, and I'm going to lightly touch along the horizon line just to further define that and give it a little more definition. Oh, you got the screenshots. Perfect. And there's this one too. So let's take these off. Again, use a hair dryer if you want to reduce the risk of ripping your paper. And I'm kind of thinking next week might be... Ooh, there we go. That was close. That was a close call. Next week we might go back to the abstract class because that one's really fun and it really helps you focus on a bunch of techniques without the pressure of having to make something kind of perfect. So here's what we did today. Again, please, if you have some extra time, send me what you did today. It always really brightens my day, and I love connecting with you guys in a way where you can talk back a little bit easier. So thank you so much. And you're trying to delve into human form. Oh my goodness, humans stress me out so much. So good luck. I hope everybody has a really wonderful day and happy Juneteenth. And if you are celebrating Father's Day today or tomorrow, happy Father's Day. And I will see you guys again soon. Thank you so much for coming today.